Good evening, everyone. Great to see you. Lots of regulars now and a few new faces as well. My daughter's teacher is here. That makes me really excited. So just to recap, like we usually do, we started week 1 with George MacDonald, who's probably my personal favorite of all the Inklings. And then we moved to G.K. Chesterton, who he and MacDonald are both influences of the Inklings group. And then we spent 2 weeks on Lewis because he's just so central and important. And now we're doing Tolkien. And then next week we're going to do 2 lesser known figures, Charles Williams and Dorothy Sayers. Raise your hand if you have read Dorothy Sayers or Charles Williams. Okay. Great. Okay, well then we will have a few people that are familiar. I'm excited to talk about them and sort of talk about them in relationship to all the other thinkers that we've done so far. So tonight with Tolkien, I feel like I have to confess that the more that I research him, the more I definitely realize I am a beginner in the Tolkien world. And so there may be 50% of you may be more Tolkienites than I am. I just have no idea. So, and wow, my parish from church is here. That's awesome. Okay. So, I want to just say that I may learn things from you, from your comments. I know my former student Hannah, she probably knows more about Tolkien than I do. But what I can offer you is a beginner's look into him. I kept it a deep, dark secret for a long time while teaching at my classical school that I had not read Lord of the Rings yet. I couldn't tell anyone because they would just gasp with incredulity and maybe fire me. So this summer I finally read the trilogy and enjoyed it tremendously. There were moments, I have to confess, where I was plodding through it, and I want to tell you that to encourage you that if you do read it, it's one of those books that there's just some slow moments, and it rewards the perseverance or endurance of just a sort of reader that keeps going. So there's moments that are full of deep psychological insight and action that's interesting and plot, and then there's a lot of descriptions of the land and the world, and he wants you to slow down. He thinks that slowing down is actually a virtue maybe that our contemporary age lacks. So I encourage you, if you've started the Fellowship of the Ring 10 times and haven't gotten through it, start it again and just force yourself like all the way through it. I think you said
100 pages.
100 pages in, you were hooked.
He does that. They're on this like long, kind of boring journey to get to the first part of their travels, and it's kind of long and boring, and then it's like you tripped and fell down a hill. It's non-stop.
Well, and I will say that it isn't boring to everyone. I like when you said that last week, someone cringed like, you thought that the book I love it from page 1 was boring. So like I do think there are people out there
that a lot when I speak. I don't.
Yeah. So it isn't gonna. So this is just for the person that struggles. I just want to encourage you. Just give it your time. Give it your perseverance. It's proved itself by the test of time. I think it's well worth it. I actually think that each book gets better. I like the second one better than the first, and then the third one better than the second one. I also do recommend writing down your favorite quotes as you read. I did that this summer, and then going back and reading through the quotes, it was like revisiting the journey I'd just been on and really seeing the heights that Tolkien took me to through these different events that the characters encounter. So, and I'm going to share a few of my favorite quotes tonight. I'm also going, before I talk about this essay, I am going to talk a little bit about his life, but I discovered an essay that I already knew about, but I hadn't really worked my way through yet, and it's called On Fairy Stories. Raise your hand if you've read On Fairy Stories. Okay. It is excellent. It's probably lesser known among Tolkien's writings. It's not a novel. It's an essay, but it's not very long. You could sit down and read it in a couple of hours, and it's his argument for his argument for what a fairy story is, what it's not, what its origin is, and why we still need them. And he particularly argues for adults reading fairy stories, and kind of explains what they are. He doesn't think that they're stories about fairies, by the way. So I thought that in itself was interesting. But just a little bit about his life. So he was born on January 3rd, 1892. And he was the son of a banker, and I can't remember what his mother did, but they went to Africa, South Africa, for his father's work, and that's where he was born. And his brother, and actually while he was there, at one point he was bitten by a gigantic spider, and it was sort of traumatic for him. And a lot of people say that spiders show up in his stories, giant ones, that's somehow tied to this experience he had as a child. He swears it doesn't connect with it at all, but how can you not know? I mean, how can you know whether, I don't know, I think it might. So what's really sad about this sort of foray in Africa is that his family, his mother and his brother traveled back to England, and his father had planned to meet them after staying there for a little bit longer. And while he was in South Africa, he contracted an illness and died. So this was when Tolkien was very young, maybe 4 or 5. So he didn't have a lot of years spent with his father. And then his mother was a single mom for the next several years, 6 to 7, and she homeschooled them. She taught Tolkien Latin. That made me happy because I'm a single homeschooling mom as well, and I teach Latin. And so she gave them the best education that she could. She moved them to an area that was close to her family that is, from what I've heard, looks a lot like the Shire is described, the Hobbit town. So Tolkien has very fond memories of that time in his childhood. And then when he was around 11 or 12, his mother had type 1 diabetes, and there was no treatment for it at the time, and she passed away as well. So he was left orphaned at the age of 11 or 12. And before she died, she actually converted from being Anglican to Catholic. And that actually created a gigantic rift in the entire family. Her family, they say that they were equivalent to what would be Baptists today. And so they were extremely disturbed by this change in her heart, and she then converted to Catholicism. They disowned her. They cut off all the money they were giving her to help her be a single mom, and she sort of had to go it on her own. And Tolkien was also baptized into the Catholic Church when that happened. And I think that parts of the family then later became Unitarian, so that's very far from Baptist. It's just sort of not Christian even. So anyway, Tolkien sort of had this kind of, I think, heroic vision of his mother pursuing the faith that she believed in, being willing to have it regardless of what the effects on her family or in how much persecution she received. And so he clung tightly to that Catholic faith, partially, I think, in honor of her and what she had carried him through. And she left him and his brother to be taken care of by a priest, a Catholic priest, who then raised them. And I don't think Tolkien was extremely close to him, but he said he learned a lot of virtues from him, and is thankful. So at that point in his life, he was sent off to an incredibly good school. So probably one of the best schools he could have been sent to in England, and that's when he started learning languages. I used to think that Tolkien learned 8 languages, but recently when I was listening to another lecture, I think it was closer to 14 languages, and he created 2 of his own when he was only 11 or 12. And so at the school, he was working with everyone was working with 3 to 4 languages, and as well as reading the classics and that kind of thing. And so he then went off to college, and when he was in college, he met Edith, the girl that he fell in love with, and the man that was his he was adopted by as a second father, completely disapproved of her. She was Protestant. He thought it would be marrying beneath him, and so he actually forbade Tolkien to have any contact with her whatsoever. And so Tolkien was upset by this, but willingly obeyed the man. And I'm calling him the man. I don't remember his name. But of course, she was brokenhearted. He was brokenhearted. They kind of went their separate ways. And the deal was basically, I'll cut off your funding for school if you have any communication with her. And then when you're 21, it's your decision. So for 3 years, they didn't communicate. And then the day he turned 21, he contacted her and asked her to marry him. And so his heart stayed very true. And she said that she had already said yes to another man, but that it was actually, she was still waiting for him in a sense. So she broke it off with this man that she was engaged to, and they spent a day together, and she was like, I'm yours. So they got married, and she actually converted to Catholicism to raise children with him in the Catholic Church. And they were married for 50 years or more, and I think he died 2 years after she did, when she died in old age. And so he does have a story in the Silmarillion. I'm blanking on the name. Is it Lucy? Beren and Luthien, that is sort of mirrors his relationship with her and his love for her, and it's a romantic story. So there isn't a lot of romance in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but Tolkien knew how to write romance. So you just have to read the story, and you'll see it's there, and it kind of reflects his love of his wife. But it was a very slow, drawn out, getting to know her over time, loving her deeply kind of love. And so he had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. He was an Oxford professor of languages, and he, unlike Lewis, so Lewis was someone who was gregarious, generally made friends wherever he went, just very sort of easy to talk to, fun to talk to. Lewis also wrote a lot. Often his first draft would be so polished that he only needed to do one more draft and it was ready to send to the publisher. So he put out a lot and put out good things on a regular basis. Tolkien was very much more of a loner. He was sort of awkward, sort of introverted. He had a few sort of individual friends here and there, and had very faithful and deep relationships with them. But that was more his way of being. He wasn't someone who would command a crowd when he gave his lectures at Oxford. Although it is said that whenever he recited Beowulf, which is one of his favorite stories, that he held the crowd in awe. That was something that even for someone as introverted and awkward as him, he loved it so much that people would hear it and they would fall in love with Old English, with Beowulf, with the story. So he was sort of known for putting on these dramatic. They called it a dramatic performance, not even just a reading. So, but he also, unlike Lewis, published very little, and it took him a long time to write what he wrote. And he went over lots and lots and lots of drafts, and would sometimes spend 10 years on something and finish and then decide not to publish it. Just, it's not good enough. And it was really Lewis and some of his other colleagues and his family that pushed him to publish Lord of the Rings, to publish some of the other things that he did, and told him, this is good enough. I think people will read this. But But The Lord of the Rings, it took him like at least 10 years, maybe over a decade to write. Of course, that was during World War II, so there were other things going on. But that sort of gives you a taste for the different type of person that he was. And he and Lewis were best friends. They had their own disagreements over the years, and I promised myself I wouldn't spend too long on the whole Lewis and Tolkien disagree on things part of this lecture, just because it's somewhat infuriating and also silly, and people can sort of go overboard on emphasizing how they disagreed on things. But Tolkien did not care for the Narnia books. For instance, he thought they were too preachy. He thought that allegory, where one thing symbolizes another, so Aslan symbolizes Christ, was just overkill, almost like propaganda. And he thought that the artistry was lost in making sort of the message primary and the art and the beauty sort of less important. And he told this to Lewis often. So that led to some hard moments. He also really did disagree with Lewis's more evangelical approach to writing. Just that Lewis chose to dedicate so many of his works to explaining his faith and trying to draw people into it. Tolkien just thought he would tell Lewis, like, you're not a preacher. You're a creator of beauty. Write something beautiful, and what happens will happen. And so that's more what Tolkien wanted to do, to create a really great work of art, to have subtle connections to his belief system in the gospel, but he wasn't sort of as direct as Lewis in, I have this goal, it's important to me that people come to the faith, and I want to explain why that should happen. What's interesting is that Tolkien in certain ways evangelized to Lewis, and was in certain ways the reason that Lewis became a Christian originally, through just conversations that they had together, and one in particular that I've mentioned in previous lectures. So, and Tolkien was definitely upset that Lewis didn't become Catholic. The fact that Lewis stayed in the Anglican Church was always something that Tolkien was frustrated by, and maybe that was rooted somewhat in his family history, but also just some deep belief disagreements. So, and the final thing to mention, and as far as their disagreements go, is that Lewis fell in love with Joy Davidson and married her later in life, and Tolkien just highly disapproved of her. He didn't think that Lewis associating with her at all was a good thing. He thought it was going to ruin their community, and he basically sort of refused to have very much to do with her, with Lewis's life at that point. And when she died suddenly of cancer, he refused to go to the funeral. So there were some deep-seated grudges, frustrations between the two, but all that being so, I think they were extremely close friends, extremely supportive of one another, and tied in intellect and spirit and emotions, and all those things. So I do think that with all of their agreements, their disagreements are interesting as well. And I will say that just as there tend to be people that are just like kind of Plato people, and other people that are sort of Aristotle people, not that they hate the other one, but they're like, I'm a Plato person, or I'm an Aristotle person. There are people that are, I'm a Lewis person versus I'm a Tolkien person. It just is like, it's kind of a personality thing. One of my best friends, Chelsea, she's the Tolkien person, I'm the Lewis person, and we have interesting arguments because of that, but we also, make up at the end and give each other a hug, and it's all okay. But it's interesting. It's like a tendency. So you can ask yourself, which one am I? And you don't have to be one. You can be both, or neither, or whatever. So I don't want to put you into a hole. Okay. So as far as, yeah, sure. You want to add?
Trivia tidbits. So the Screw Table Edition was actually dedicated to Tolkien. Possibly in homage or reference to that conversation. The Tolkien, like Lewis, his writing was not necessarily part of his day job, or at least the writing for which he is known today. His academic credit was basically turning the world on to Beowulf. Prior to Tolkien, literally prior to one essay he wrote, Beowulf was considered a piece of language, not a great work of literature, upon which much other literature was based. And so it was the one lecture he gave in the essay from that clued everybody into, no, it was a great work of poetry and could stand on its own. I mentioned this before, but I'm also encouraged that he really affected the world with his hobby, not what he was paid, to do day in and day out, for the 40 hours a week or whatever. And so, as a hobby artist with a professional love, I'm very encouraged by that.
Yes. That's good. Thank you for that. So transitioning to the handout, and I don't know how many of you have one. There are probably many more over there. And these quotes are going to be on the screen as well, in case you don't get a copy. I want to spend the first maybe 2/3 of the lecture on this essay called On Fairy Stories, and then the last third on just favorite quotes from the trilogy, and I think they all connect with the imagination, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how they do. So for our first passage, so just first of all, the essay on fairy stories asks 3 questions. I mentioned them earlier. It asks about the origin of fairy stories. It asks what they are. What are they? And what use do we have for them? So, looking at our first quote, he says, stories that are actually concerned primarily with fairies, that is, with creatures that might also in modern English be called elves, are relatively rare and as a rule not very interesting. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm or upon its shadowy marches. A fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, whatever its own main purpose may be: satire, adventure, morality, fantasy. Fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic, but it is magic of a peculiar mood and power, at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. There is one proviso. If there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of: the magic itself. That must in that story be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away. So, in certain ways, Tolkien gives a very open-ended definition of what fairy stories are. First of all, he says what they're not. So they're not just stories about fairies. And if you think about the stories that you consider fairy tales, Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, Jack and the Beanstalk, none of these stories have fairies in them. So it is kind of funny when you think about it that we call them fairy tales, because very few of them have small magic creatures. And like he says, there aren't that many out there, and the ones that we do have are only sort of good. They're not fantastic. So what he does say it's about, and he gives an extremely open-ended definition, is sort of a journey in what he calls perilous realm. And he says also it involves what he calls magic. So in certain ways, I think he thinks of fairy, like he calls it fairy, this element or this essence, as something that is sort of beyond definition, because this itself is not a definition. You can talk, I mean, perilous realm, lots of realistic novels have, you could say they have a perilous realm sort of sense to them. I think that for him, to a certain degree, fairy stories are, you sort of know them when you see them, and this kind of gets at some of the elements of them, but it is, they are stories where there is something difficult, there's difficulty involved, and there's something that I'm going to come back to. But I would argue, and I think Tolkien would argue, and I think I found this in his books as well, that all of the good fairy tales, he thinks, involve both difficulty and possibility. So, in one sense, things are really tough. There's some problem that one or many of the characters are facing, and that's why he says that the mood, I think this is interesting, the mood is a serious one. At least, he says, when it comes to the magic. That the magic itself calls for a kind of reverence or seriousness. There's almost a holiness to it that's required by the character, and that's because the character is in a difficulty and is dependent on the magic in one sense for things to go well. But he also would say it isn't difficulty without possibility. So if, and this is why he's gonna argue that hope is the thing that brings these two together. So when you have difficulty but you don't have possibility, you have a sort of despair story, basically. And you could say maybe a lot of 20th century realistic novels have a good degree of difficulty without possibility. But it's also not possibility without difficulty. So it isn't this sort of presumptuous tale where everything really kind of goes happily and we're in the clouds and, you know, everything's good. If you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings movies, Frodo's facial expression most of the time is like, he's almost dead. Like in his face, it looks like I am not happy. Like life is really, 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 really hard. So that element, I think, for Tolkien is actually really important. But it never turns into despair. It always hangs on to possibility. And I think that for him is connected to the idea of magic being involved. He doesn't think of magic as, he says it's not that laborious scientific magician. So he isn't going to say it's someone who has figured out how the earth works. And so, I mean, I kind of tend to think of people that are really good at the computer as like magicians a little bit. Because something's going wrong and I just like give it to them and they're like, and it's like, fixed, like completely. And to me, that looks like magic. Like it really seems like magic. And so, and I think scientists kind of have this as well. They can predict how things, you know, when stars are going to do certain things, when the sun's going to do things, and so it feels like they have this magical power. And Tolkien says he isn't talking about the kind of magic that you just know a lot and therefore can predict how things will turn out through cause and effect. The magic is sort of, in a sense, beyond the capacity of reason to understand. And that's why a person sort of depends on it in a serious way in order for it to help that person. And I think that for him that's linked with the supernatural, with depending on something beyond oneself that you don't have control over. He talks a lot about the magic only working well when it's not grasped in a possessive way. And we talked a little bit about this with Lewis, that he has certain characters who, like Uncle Andrew and the Magician's Nephew, where they get a hold of the magic of Narnia and they want to twist it to their own devices, and they want to do what they want with it. And for Lewis, the idea of treating magic with the seriousness is actually not seeking to possess it, but kind of obeying its rules. That there's a rule to the realm that that you have to sort of give honor to, but in a sense also not used to wield something that would give you ultimate power. And obviously that should make you think of the ring, which has that. So that is really how he defines fairy stories. Again, for like the philosopher part of me, that's not a definition at all. But I think he's doing that on purpose. He wants to leave it kind of open-ended and say this is generally when you see one, you know what it is, and it has some of these elements. So any questions before we keep going? Or comments? Okay, so our next quote. He asked the question. He's asking about, this is when he gets to the origin part. He asks, is there any essential connection between children and fairy stories? So we talked last week and we said Lewis actually meant the Narnia tales to be in the genre of children's stories, but he wanted it to be something that could be read and appreciated by all human beings. And so adults are not ever too old to read Narnia. But he wrote it to not exclude children. Tolkien actually thinks, and I'll just finish out this quote, he says, I think this connection is an error, at best an error of false sentiment. Indeed, insofar as they have been so banished from a full adult art, they have been ruined. So he actually is of the opinion that for centuries, fairy tales have been something, for the most part, written by adults, and for the most part enjoyed, yes, sometimes by children, but often by other adults. I mean, Grimm's fairy tales, they're very dark. I've tried to be a purist with my daughters on just books that I read to them, so I always want to find the original, like, let's read the original Little Mermaid, and let's read the original this and that. And oh my goodness, the originals are always way darker than the Disney version or whatever version that we use today. And so I think I was under the impression that fairy tale means suitable for children, you know? But what I'm finding is I have to pre-read these fairy tales before. I tried to give Hans Christian Andersen to my to my daughter, and she read a few of them, and she threw the book across the room and told me she was going to have nightmares. So Tolkien is arguing no, fairy stories are not just for children, but because of us, something in our culture has pushed them to he calls the nursery, and he thinks that it's something of a sickness in our culture that actually has caused us to do that. I think he's going to link it somewhat with the Enlightenment, with the sort of obsession with science and progress and technology as the thing that makes us sort of on top of the world. And so thinking about things, needing things to be realistic, pragmatic, understandable by reason, and anything that goes beyond that, especially anything that uses magic or is otherworldly, thinking of that in this sort of diminutive way as only for children who are gullible and will believe things like that. So he says, no, actually it isn't true that the child has the more cultivated imagination than the adult, that if the child has grown and become an adult and grown in the right way, then the adult will have a more cultivated imagination. It's just that unfortunately adults tend to turn it off at some point, and it just sort of deadens over time, and it makes it really hard for them to pick up a book of fairy tales and read them and really appreciate them. So, and this was actually kind of convicting to me. It was affirming and convicting. So it was affirming in that I have found in just deciding to read a lot to my kids, I'm finding this, I'm like falling in love with some of these books that I'm reading to them. And a lot of them I don't really think as just books for kids. I think I'm reading this for me, like I need this, and so I'll be weeping while I'm reading to them and like, Mom, what's the big deal? And, just like, it's just so good. It's just so true. And like, they really don't get it like all the way. They don't get all the stuff that's going on. And me at 35, like, I need it, like, for my life. And so I think reading this and seeing his argument is just affirming, because it affirms that experience I've had recently. It's also convicting, because I don't often think, oh, for my next book, I'll pick up Grimm's fairy tales, or I'll pick up Hans Christian Andersen. I tend to think, oh, I should have my daughter read that one next, you know. So I think that's a challenge to us as adults to really read those fairy tales and see what they speak into our lives, see what they encourage us to do or to become. And it may be that we were not ready for them when we were 12, but we are ready for them in our 20s and our 30s. And so, yeah, I think he has a good argument there. Okay, so the next part in the essay, he is talking about just the idea that he has of man, of the human being, as what he calls sub-creator or sub-maker. And what he's thinking about, and this sort of goes to the question of what does it mean to be a artist? What does it mean to be not just an artist, but a Christian artist, I think, in a certain sense. Tolkien never says that the human being is a creator or is a maker, because what he thinks is that, in a sense, only God can be ultimately a creator, create out of nothing, or maker out of nothing. That whenever we as artists create things, we're using spare parts. We're using the things in the world that have piqued our interest, have piqued our imagination. There's never a time when we create something out of absolutely nothing. And so but by being made in God's image, even though fallen, we have this desire to create. And that's something that we're mirroring our Creator when we do that. But he thinks that we do it best when we think of ourselves as a sub-creator or sub-maker instead of a maker with a capital M, or a creator with a capital C. So he says, the incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world coeval. An essential power of fairy is thus the power of making immediately effective by the will the visions of fantasy. Not all are beautiful or even wholesome, not at any rate the fantasies of fallen man. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. Fairy begins. Man becomes a sub-creator. Although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white, to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. That right has not decayed, we make still by the law in which we're made. Fantasy remains a human right, we make in our measure and in our derivative mode, because we are made. And not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. So I could say so much about this. I love, there's so many things he's doing here, and I can only speak to a few, but this really, it speaks to, this is sometimes called the Christian worldview, CFR. I kind of hate acronyms, but creation, fall, redemption, that the sort of larger story of the meta-narrative of the world is the idea that man has been created by a good God. He's been made in his image. He's been given lordship over creation, and so he reflects his creator in a lot of these essential ways, but that through the fall, all of the things that about him that made him great also sort of come to his own destruction, but through the sort of process of grace and process of redemption, even though he's disgraced, as Tolkien said, there's this light that still shines through, and he still sort of yearns and desires and seeks to be what he was created to be, and that is a maker. It's interesting in the Quran, when God makes the world, he doesn't let Adam name any of the animals. He actually tells Adam, I'm going to tell you all the names of the animals, and you have to memorize them and say them back to me, and if you can do that, then I'll let you sort of reign on the earth. And it's so interesting that for the Quran, like, the understanding is that God does not really share the creative process with man, but in the scriptures, Adam is given the task of naming the animals. God could have done that. He probably would have come up with better names, maybe, than God, you know. But he chose to ask Adam to do that, and so there's instilled in him this sort of natural desire to name things, to create, to make. And Tolkien thinks that when we create stories, when we take delight in them, when we read them, when we paint paintings, when we create any kind of art, that we're sort of reclaiming that lordship that we were created to have at the original creation. And he thinks that we're kind of drawn, we're pulled after that, that we're sort of endlessly pulled after that, and that in certain ways good fairy tales are the things that awaken that desire in us to be sort of co-makers. He does point out a really interesting thing in, is this my eraser? I'm not sure.
Or this one.
Okay, I can use this. This will work. He does do something pretty interesting on fairy tales with the imagination. He says that there is what he calls the imagination, and he says that is the image making part of us. And you could say image making or image collecting, that we sort of notice and collect images around us. I mean, even when you come up with a dragon, an image of a dragon, it's a like mixture of lots of different parts of images that you already sort of have had when you've encountered the world. He also says that there is this thing that is sort of pulling all the images together and giving them what he calls the inner consistency of reality. So he says it's one thing to create a green sun in your story. It's another thing to tell a story where the green sun is really believable, where it actually makes perfect sense in that world and seems even maybe better than, not better than a yellow sun, but suitable. It makes sense within it. And so he calls that art. And what he thinks that fantasy is the like bringing together of these two powers in our minds, the power to have images to imagine, and the power to have a sort of inner consistency of reality, and that is what fantasy is able to do, and that it's able to take things that are sort of utterly strange. So hobbits, those are strange creatures, right? Now they're not, maybe, because we're so used to them. We even have a Hobbit cafe in Houston. But when you first learn about them, they have a strangeness to them. But then as you read about them, and I notice this, it's just beautiful. I notice it when one of my daughters reads about it to the other one. They create a little tent in their bed, and they read about hobbit holes and all of the sort of habits of hobbits, and they're creating a little hole like while they're doing it. And there's this inner consistency of the picture he makes that makes it believable. He says what it creates in them is what he would call secondary belief. So primary belief is sort of your ultimate foundational beliefs about reality that you never let go of. Secondary belief is a kind of belief in something real that is almost just as real as that primary, but it's sort of one step beyond, or one step away from the real thing. But you sort of hold it with such a conviction because it's been crafted into this sort of beautiful whole. So this is sort of how he comes up with the term fantasy, and he thinks it's really hard to write a story that's utterly strange and actually still has the inner consistency of reality. That like most modern fantasy you read is maybe lacking in this. Or it has the inner consistency, but it lacks in the image making. It could have that as well. So I think it might, if you just thinking bad fantasy, it's usually the lacking of the art side than it is the lack of the image making side. So any comments on that? I just think that insight from him is really significant.
Where did he feel was Lewis's shortcoming?
So he thought it was in the art side. Yeah. He thought things were too haphazardly thrown together in the Narnia book. You know, like Father Christmas shows up in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he's like, "Where does that come from? You know, how is that related to anything? He just Christmas, Santa Claus. You know." So yeah, I mean, he just thought there's some weird stuff going on that he isn't working hard enough at building this world that all sort of fits nicely together. So. It hurts my heart to say it, but I mean, he has a good point. He does. So, okay, next quote. He says, "To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed narrative art, story making in its primary and most potent mode." So that what he would call then, another word he would call this is elvish craft, almost like magic. And I think there's something. I think there's actually something true in other forms of art where these two have to be brought together. So visual art, when a painter paints a painting, there are images, and there's like things that you do with the images that are interesting, but you have to have an inner consistency to the picture. You have to have a unity to make the image make sense. Of course, there are a lot of pictures at the Manil that don't make any sense, but you know, that's also making its own point on its own. So I don't know. I don't know what Tolkien would say about some of the modern art, the broken mirror and the cheese with mold growing out of it. So. But I do think that other forms of art sort of require these two things. So the next quote, he says, "For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, but not slavery to it." So this is actually really important to Tolkien, and the next quote actually connects with it. But the idea is that for a good fantasy writer cannot hate this world. They cannot hate the way things are or the way we ought to see things. So their purpose in creating fantasy can't be, I just like my escapist world better than the one that I see in front of me. He actually thinks that the truly good fantasy writer has eyes to see the beauty of the real world in such a way that it brings to life the things that are in front of us in a much truer, fuller way than we were able to see them before. And I think this is an important point. And it probably helps the fantasy genre in terms of its being accused of being escapist. So for Tolkien, the good fantasy novel is one that we return to the new world, to the real world with eyes that love the rocks and the trees and the flowers more than we did the first time. So this next quote, he says, recovery, and that concept of recovering the real world, he calls it recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view, seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need, in any case, to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. So for Tolkien, in his creating of Middle-earth, it isn't that all of a sudden he's created a green sun and he loves that green sun and this world seems boring and silly in comparison. It's that now he can look at the tree outside of his house or the stones along the creek bed, and or he can look at the bread and wine as he has the Lord's Supper, and like all of these things are enchanted with so much more reality than they had before. They're more beautiful, they're more real, and so he says he hasn't become a slave to those things, but they've recovered or regained the eyes that we were meant to see them with. Actually, I'm going to mess up your PowerPoint and skip over to one of the really great quotes, because Tolkien helped me, and this is the one on the last page. It's titled Ents. And so I love trees a lot, like too much almost, and I think trees are magical. I can hug them without shame now, and I just want to sit beneath them and be happy all day long. There's something truly amazing going on in them. And I think even the different types of trees have these different character traits or personalities that teach me how to be a fuller human being. Having said that, and having already felt that, when I read this section that Tolkien wrote about the Ents, which are talking trees, I loved them 10 times more. And I think that this is a great example of him taking something, changing it for the fantasy genre, but doing so in such a way that you come back to the real thing, the regular tree, and you love it more because it means more to you. So this is the quote. He says, "One felt as if there was an enormous well behind them, filled up with ages of memory and long, slow, steady thinking. Their surface was sparkling with the present, like sun shimmering on the outer leaves of a vast tree or in the ripples of a very deep lake. I don't know, but it felt as if something that grew in the ground, asleep you might say, or just feeling itself as something between root tip and leaf tip, between deep earth and sky, had suddenly waked up. It was considering you with the same slow care that it had given to its own inside affairs far endless years." So the Ents in the story, they're kind of comic a little bit. They talk really slowly. They take forever to say what they're trying to say. They listen attentively to you as you talk. They hear every single syllable. They think deeply about it before they respond. The characters that encounter them in the story feel frustrated because they want to get to the next sentence and the next part of the tale. But and when the Ents have a little meeting with other Ents, all slow thinking, slow talking beings, what should take an hour takes days and days and days and days, and the characters are just sitting there waiting for this meeting to be over because they who knows how slow they're talking to one another, and it's just wonderful. And the thing is that the characters say that when they have these conversations though with the Ents, they're being fully, deeply loved by them in those moments. That the Ents are not thinking, they're not looking at their cell phones, they're not checking their messages, They're not wondering what they're going to do next. They're not thinking about their to-do list. They're completely present, listening to the person that's talking to them, soaking it in, ready to give them years if it takes that to sort of know what they have to say and to fully appreciate it. And it's beautiful. I think Tolkien thinks that that's actually how human relationships are supposed to work. That we're not supposed to be friends in this sort of instant way because we met on Facebook and we connect in all these ways and now we're best friends forever. He thinks, no, it actually takes years and years of just sort of being, doing life together, being present, and like when the other person is boring, like sitting and waiting for them to respond to you for a long time and not checking your phone every few seconds. But sort of just being there with them and sort of enduring the long haul. And so Tolkien thinks trees help us remember this because trees are long living things, and they're beautiful. They have green leaves that grow every year, but they also have these trunks that get bigger and bigger in these like long spans of time. And so now, and so this is why I see a tree and I like want to hug it, because I just think you would sit and listen to me for I could talk about my daughters who other people probably get tired of hearing about, but I could talk about them to you for a year and you would keep listening, and I just like feel so loved, you know, and maybe it's in my head, but you know, I still think like there's something magnificent going on there, and something that maybe teaches us about how to be better human beings to one another. So yeah, any comments? I love the Ents. They're great. I probably would like get you know distracted and want to check my phone if I was talking to an Ent for too long. But that's just my confession. So okay, next quote. So this is asking the question, what use are they? Going back to that, he's already said that they have the value of recovering lost vision of reality, making us see things in a truer way. He's also going to say that they provide what he calls catastrophe. So it comes from catastrophe, something going totally wrong, and or a sudden change of events. But Hugh meaning good, and he thinks that a really good fairy tale has a series of events that present the person with seemingly endless difficulties, where you don't see how in the world the character is going to get out of this problem. Rumpelstiltskin is probably one where you're just like, what is she going to do? She's going to lose her baby. It's really pretty sad. Hansel and Gretel, also disturbingly dark, and you just think, how in the world are they going to get out? And even Cinderella is a little bit just out there. And he says that all of a sudden that there's this perseverance of the characters. The characters sort of keep believing, even when everything looks like it's hopeless. They keep sort of holding out possibility. And all of a sudden there is this this change of events, this turn of events, and what was horrible is suddenly made very good. And there's even something about the horrible needing to come first before the good comes and sort of rescues things. That if the good was just sort of there from the beginning, it wouldn't be quite the same. And he says that actually, in fact, that the incarnation of Christ is the Hugh catastrophe for creation, for the creation of the world, and that the resurrection is the Hugh catastrophe of the incarnation. So that there's this sort of ultimate one that is the Christian story in a sense, and I actually think that that's one of the reasons people criticize fairy tales, is like the happy ending. They lived happily ever after, and people are like, ha ha ha, yeah, right. You know, you get married and then things get hard or whatever. You know, no one ever does fairy tales about the marriage. They just do it about falling in love. You know, things like that. And there is some truth to like especially Disney versions of love, and how it's like the honeymoon period, and that's really about all you get. But Tolkien thinks that the happy ending is not trite, is not sort of the belief of the 3-year-old that then becomes an adult, and then you tell them the real truth that there is no real happy ending. He thinks that, but he thinks that the hardship has to sort of be endured and gone through before that sort of redemption comes at the end. And he thinks like a fairy tale shows you, it makes you endure all of that hard before it gives you that turnaround. But it says that's possible. It like always holds out that possibility that could happen. So he says in this quote, he says, "I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. The consolation of fairy tales, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy tales can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, which means good news, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief." So he says it doesn't deny what he calls discatastrophe, a bad catastrophe, life being extremely hard, there being tons of sorrow and grief. And if you read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I mean, it's like reading Crime and Punishment. I mean, there is a lot of just downers. I mean, that's part of the reason it's hard to get through, is they're just in the depths of almost despair for quite a long time. And but Tolkien knows that's like real life. I mean, that's what the hardship of things are. But he doesn't think that negates the joyous ending. He actually thinks that weeping lasts for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And so he thinks that fairy tales keep these two poles and it holds them together. It doesn't throw one out, but it holds them both in place. So this final quote from On Fairy Stories, he says, "It is the mark of a good fairy story of the higher or more complete kind that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. In such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire, that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. It looks forward or backward. The direction in this regard is unimportant to the great eucatastrophe." So I love this. I myself struggle with depression. I have dark, just sort of despairing thoughts most days, evenings especially, and so it's just tempting a lot to believe that those thoughts are the definition of existence, that the gleam of sort of joy of possibility is gone, and really sort of happy, encouraging, it'll all turn out okay kind of like encouragement doesn't always help when I'm feeling that way, because I wish I could just be happy. I wish I could just sort of just dance around and be optimistic, but there's like a weight like on my soul, like that I'm carrying, that it won't go away. And I think and so when I was reading through the trilogy this summer of Lord of the Rings, I felt that he conveyed that deep sense of gloom, that his characters did know what it was like to go through that sort of dark night of the soul. And he sort of took me through those things, and but he also brought in this joy that just didn't seem trite when it came. It seemed real. It seemed fought for, and sort of lightened something in me, like pierced through something that I didn't think could be pierced through. And so I think he's right. I think that a good fairy tale is one that takes the darkness seriously, and it lets it be maybe very dark, but points to a light at the end that turns all of that around and makes it sort of well worth the waiting. But if you just hold on a little bit longer, it's going to turn out. You just keep holding on. You just keep sort of persevering. So. The quotes that I have from the trilogy are actually, now as I sort of confess that part about me and these books, I realized that these quotes were kind of the ones that I read on those hard nights, and did something that pierced through the dark. So I'm going to just read through them and then leave it open for questions or comments, especially experiences that you all have had in reading the books yourself. So this first one, Hope in Darkness. Even Gollum was not wholly ruined. He had proved tougher. There was a little corner of his mind that was still his own, and light came through it as through a chink in the dark. Light out of the past. It was actually pleasant, I think, to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memories of wind and trees and sun on the grass and such forgotten things. And then this one is on courage. There is a seed of courage hidden, often deeply, it is true, in the heart of the fattest and most timid hobbit. I love that. Waiting for some final and desperate danger to make it grow. Frodo thought he had come to the end of his adventure, and a terrible end. But the thought hardened him. He found himself stiffening as if for a final spring. He no longer felt limp like helpless prey. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. It's one of my favorite lines ever in existence. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes as fire shall be woken, a light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken, the crownless again shall be king. And skipping the one from our dear friends the Ents. Join sorrow. Pippin glanced in some wonder at the face now beside his own, for the sound of Gandalf's laugh had been gay and merry. Yet, in the wizard's face he saw at first only lines of care and sorrow. Though as he looked more intently, he perceived that under all there was a great joy, a fountain of mirth enough to set a kingdom laughing, were it to gush forth. This part in particular, this is at a very dark place in the novel. Everything seems hopeless, and he sees this possibility in Gandalf's face of a deep joy that something is about to happen that will turn everything around. And this is great. Imagination in the trenches. Can you sing? This is the king asking Pippin while they're sort of in the midst of war, waiting for the next thing to happen. He says, "Can you sing?" "Yes," said Pippin. "Well, yes, enough for my own people. But we have no songs fit for great halls and evil times, Lord. We seldom sing of anything more terrible than wind and rain. And most of my songs are about things that make us laugh, or about food and drink, of course. And why should such songs be unfit for my halls, or for such hours as these? We who have lived long under the shadow may surely listen to echoes from a land untroubled by it. Then we may feel that our vigil was not fruitless, though it may have been thankless. There's this thing about the hobbits that some of them, that I love, and it's just this sort of underlying like cheeriness, and it's not trite, because they struggle, they go through rough things, they worry, they do all these things, but they love to just sit down and have a good meal, and tell stories and sing songs together, and can stop and do that in the midst of really, really hard times, and they can do it with one another, and doing it in friendship strengthens them. And I just think it's just this sort of very unassuming creature who you would think would not be the kind of creature to take into a giant battle, but at these moments where everyone is sort of near despair, it's the Hobbit's song that sort of lifts their spirits, and I think that there's something almost gospelish about that the weak become stronger than the strong in a certain sense. And then stewardship says, other evils there are that may come, for Sauron is himself but a servant or emissary, yet it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. So there's this ongoing theme that I really love, and I think he gets it from George MacDonald and probably in Chesterton and some others, but that even in the darkest of times, when it seems like all hope is lost, there is always before us some small task to do, something we can do to the betterment of either those around us, or something that sort of connects with our gifts, and that may not seem like anything in the grand scheme of things, but if everyone were to go about that small task in front of them, they would move the world, and so there's something about, kind of being okay with not knowing how the big catastrophic thing is going to be fixed, but in this moment, in the present, doing what you can do to make things better. So that's what I have for tonight. Yeah. Any comments or questions before we finish? We have about 15 minutes, a little bit less. Anyone have similar experiences with the trilogy, or common experiences? Yeah. Yes.
It's not so much about similar experiences. Just two quick thoughts. It seems like you can see the commonality between Lewis and Tolkien in several of these quotes. This idea of a painful joy. Not them alone, but that was a big deal with
Yes.
Lewis as well. And also, it's not, when Aslan says to Lucy, that's not your story.
Yes.
You give your story, that kind of
Exactly.
But I was, because of your talk, I read Orthodoxy, and the last line of it, the last word is mirth. He says, Lord Jesus is hiding something. We can't see it. It's not sorrow. It's not judgment. He's laughing. And that quote from Gandalf, I think it's, quote about Gandalf.
A fountain of mirth enough to set a kingdom laughing.
Yeah, you had
For
said
it to gush forth.
that Chesterton had a pretty big influence on Tolkien. It seems like
That connection is there. Yeah. No, that's really good.
One of the quotes I think that you read, Tolkien really follows his own advice. When he, kind of the understatement of the year, when you read to make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, with the way he constructed Middle-earth, he really did this. I think it's his son that published the Histories of Middle-earth, which is like a 10-volume set. He created a reality that he called Middle-earth, and I think all good art does this. It becomes a window, like the Star Wars trilogy, the original trilogy, is a great example of this. Like, you're peering into a window, and there's way more going on than you can see, and you know it's there, and you wish you could see more of it. And so it's like his stories just they almost whet your appetite for more. How he did this is how to make good art, whatever your field, the words, paintbrush, music, whatever. These are fantastic stories. Have to share. So Ecclesiastes, chapter 8, verse 15. So I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of the life God has given them under the sun. It's the Hobbit's verse.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That is. Very good. Well, thank you guys for coming tonight.